Going. Are we recording? Yep. Okay. All right, everyone. Welcome to the second Freight Advisory Committee meeting that we're having on this topic. I know it's a lot of meetings for everyone, and we really appreciate you participating. This is some really interesting stuff we're getting into. Today, the bulk of the presenting is going to be from the Michael Baker International part of the team. Of course, Kittleson and Associates is leading it with support from Michael Baker, North Economics, and Huddle. We also have Eric Taylor on the line today. I saw him log in. He's our DOT representative, project representative. Okay. Just a brief review of what we're going to cover today. Again, this is part 2 of this discussion that we've been having. We've talked about all these things so far. We're going to go over them again in more detail and start making some decisions. Again, we're going to talk about, you're going to hear people say PHFS. We're going to talk about the primary highway freight system. Again, an overview of what it is and redesignation. We're going to talk about priority freight corridor recommendations in 2 buckets, federal designations and the state multimodal freight network that this plan is going to make recommendations for. And then this is where you started to give us some really good ideas last time. We initially dove into the draft freight action strategies. We're going to go into those again today. Okay, so that's what we're going to cover today. Again, quickly, where we are in the process, we are really just finishing up the data collection and analysis phase. And because of the financial analysis technical memorandum, we're finalizing the financial analysis technical memo. And we're moving into the strategic direction phase. That's a lot of the work that we're doing today. Vision, goals, performance measures. We're preparing to really get into scenario planning and performance measures. That's what the goals and action strategies discussion is going to drive. Okay. All right, let's just get into it. Brian, I'm going to read the slide deck. That seemed to be the quickest way and the least amount of bandwidth taken. And we gave you all those materials in advance. We might toggle back and forth between the presentation and that interactive map that we provided in advance. So go ahead, Brian. Take it away, and I'll advance when you tell me to.
Okay, thank you, Holly, and hello, everyone. It's good to be back with you again to kind of pick up where we left off during our September meeting and talking about the PHFS and the redesignation opportunities that we have available. So as part of today's meeting, we're going to really be picking up where we left off from last time. We have new information to present to you. We've had meetings with the Federal Highway Administration last week, and we want to be updating you on some of the outcomes of that meeting as well as it pertains to the work ahead on this redesignation opportunity. So again, why don't we go ahead and get started by kind of a reintroduction of the PHFS and the various elements, the various subsystems of the PHFS as they appear there up on the screen. Again, we have nearly 1,200 miles of PHFS that have been designated throughout Alaska. And again, we can think of the PHFS as kind of the national highway system, if you will, for freight. And this is a fairly new designation that was created from the FAST Act when it was signed back in 2015. And again, it provides for those roadways that have been identified as being part of the PHFS network and its various other subsystems. Those roadways are eligible for National Highway Program freight funding as well as federal freight grants. So it's a very important designation for Alaska. And currently, throughout the state, we have around, again, I mentioned 1,200 miles that crisscross the state of Alaska. You see the interstates that form the bulk of all of the mileage, you know, the Sterling and the Seward highways, the Tote Cutoff, other highways, but the interstates really comprise the majority of what encompasses the PHFS network in Alaska. You see that last bullet there in the upper left-hand corner of the slide. As part of the redesignation process, we are looking for guidance from the Freight Advisory Committee. In meetings with James and Eric, they're very interested in getting comment from this committee with regard to this redesignation process. There are other elements of the National Highway Freight Network. Again, the PHFS has the bulk of the mileage, but there are other subsystems that are part of this priority freight network. You see the PHFS intermodal connectors, and these are roadways that connect our major intermodal facilities like Ted Stevens, like the Port of Alaska. It connects those intermodal facilities to the PHFS. And so you see we have roughly 30 miles of those roadways that have been designated across the state. Again, these are critical first and last mile connectors to the PHFS. Down below, we have smaller subsystems within the National Highway Freight Network. You've heard us talk at the prior meeting about the critical urban and critical rural freight corridors. And again, the primary designation differences between the urban and the rural is just whether or not the roadway lies inside or outside of an urbanized area. There are caps that the federal government is imposing on all of the states. So each state gets its own allowance, if you will, of highway mileage that can be designated as part of these priority freight networks. And you see the numbers there for the rural freight corridors. We have a budget of 244 miles, and on the urban side, it's 122 miles. If you'll recall, at the last meeting, we had shown you the highway segments that have been designated by Alaska and then certified by the Federal Highway Administration for inclusion within these priority networks. And you can see in the lower left-hand corner there, we have the Dalton Highway, which really consumes 235 miles of our budget among the 244 that are available to us. So that's largely a segment of the Dalton Highway. And in the lower right-hand corner, you see the allocation that Alaska is eligible for, 122 miles. And so far, we've only designated fewer than 15 miles as part of that network. So again, I mentioned at the last meeting that Alaska is living beneath its privileges with regard to the urban freight corridor designation. And so as part of the update of the state's freight plan, we wanted to take the advantage of the opportunity while we're looking at priority freight corridors on the state level as well as the federal level. This is a prime opportunity to take a hard look at those critical urban freight corridors within our urbanized areas and make some recommendations with regard to additional roadway segments that could be added to that priority network. And we're going to be previewing those with you here during our time today. To date, the urban freight corridors that have been designated in Alaska are all within the Fairbanks urbanized area. So our team has looked at other areas around the state where additional mileage could be added to this priority network. Okay. Again, we're looking at a looming deadline of October 25th. AASHTO has petitioned the Federal Highway Administration for an extension on this deadline. AASHTO has requested an extension into the December timeframe. At this point, we're not sure the status of that request, if that's going to be honored or not, or if the feds are going to continue to hold to that October 25th deadline. So more to come on that. But again, it's a looming deadline that we want to be responsive to. And again, you see the dollar amounts there. It's roughly 19 million. It's available for Alaska. And as I mentioned last time, that's a drop in the bucket, admittedly, but it is welcome added business for the state. And again, I think it's important to remember too that as we designate additional roadway segments for these priority freight corridors. It doesn't bring more money to Alaska, but it does give the DOT more options with regard to different federal pots of money that are available to program against different improvements that are being programmed. Okay. I mentioned that we met with the Federal Highway Administration last Friday. We had a good meeting with them, and they reminded us that they are interested not only in knowing what additional highway segments that you would recommend as a freight advisory committee, but they're also interested in your thoughts on the methodology that they are considering for the allocation of this new mileage. There are roughly 1,200 miles nationwide that are going to be added to this priority network. So if you'll recall, I mentioned that Alaska already has 1,200 miles of this priority freight mileage. They're going to be adding that total nationwide, just to give you some context. There have been interstates that have been constructed since the FAST Act was passed back in 2015. And so these new interstates are going to be gobbling up the top of that mileage. So we're left with about 960 miles that are going to be left over that will be allocated among the states. The feds are currently looking at two options for allocating this mileage. One option would be everyone gets the same. We're looking at an equal allocation. It would translate into roughly 18 miles of additional PHFS mileage for each state. All right, so that's one option. A second option would be taking a look at the so-called high mileage states. And Alaska is one of those. Alaska is a high mileage state. And that just simply means that Alaska has greater than a 2% share of the national total. So there are other states that are, that have a lot of freight activity, or they're large geographically. So states like Texas and Montana, California, Pennsylvania, and others are part of these high mileage states. If the feds were to go with option 2, it would translate into roughly 55 miles for Alaska. So again, those are the two options that the feds are weighing right now. We really didn't get a sense from them last Friday, which direction they're leaning, but they did indicate that they were interested in any feedback from the Freight Advisory Committee on your preferences as they relate to Alaska, the equal allocation method or equal allocation for the states that are high mileage. So keeping those things in mind, I wanted to throw these numbers out there from the simple standpoint that we're not looking at wholesale changes to the PHFS. So we can't look at this redesignation opportunity as a panacea that we're going to be adding hundreds and hundreds of miles to our network. We're not looking at that kind of a situation. So it's going to be a bit of fine tuning to the network. One of the proposals that we wanted to put in front of you for consideration as a potential addition to the PHFS was the Elliott-Steese Highway from Fairbanks and providing a connection to the Dalton Highway. And I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Okay. You should see a web map of the state of Alaska. And
That's good, Brian.
You can see it, okay. The corridors in red are the existing PHFS, and you can see how the interstates light up the map. Some of the other segments that you'll see here were proposed additions to the PHFS. You'll see the Seward Highway and the highway to Valdez. The segment in turquoise entails the Dalton Highway that has already been certified as a critical rural freight corridor. And so as part of our suggested proposal would be to add this segment here of the Elliott Highway, which would provide a connection from existing PHFS networks here in Fairbanks and the Dalton Highway. It would make that a continuous segment as a roadway.
Brian, if you're zooming in,
Yes.
we're not seeing your zoom in. So we're just seeing the small map. It's a little bit tough to see.
Okay, I am zooming in on this segment. It's not coming through, you're saying?
No, it is not. And that other people are having that issue too.
Okay.
Which is great because it's worked 4 times this week, but not today.
Sure.
Okay. I'm going to ask a question. Casey, do you want to try to share your screen, or would you like me to try to share my screen?
I have the application pulled up on my end, so I can give it a shot.
Okay, so why don't you stop sharing, Brian, and we'll have Casey start sharing.
All right. I am stopping.
All right, we can see your screen now, Casey. Let's see if you can zoom in. Yep.
Okay, so keep talking, Brian. It's doing great, and Casey will drive.
So we are at that hot pink area, everybody, the Elliott Highway, that missing link. There we go. Perfect, Casey.
Okay. And again, just to pick up where we left off, this is our team's recommendation as a potential addition to the PHFS. We do recognize that it's 76 miles in length. So it may fall outside of what FHWA is willing to yield to Alaska. But in looking at this and the 2 other proposals that we had, we felt that this segment made the most sense as a recommendation to FHWA to include as part of the PHFS. This would provide a link to the road that's the only road I'm aware of that is referred to as the road to the bank. So that would indicate to me a freight priority for Alaska. So again, this designation, this potential designation would make this particular roadway, this mileage here, eligible for funding from the National Highway Freight Program.
But Brian, we should note here that this does exceed both allowances that FHWA says are allowed. So it exceeds the 18 miles under scenario 1 and the 55 miles under scenario 2. But in our talks with DOT, they would like to ask for the most and maybe get the allocations revised. So the way we came up with this was an analysis of all of the different routes and the missing links and the desire to have better connectivity. So these routes came from an analysis of what's already designated and conversations with DOT.
Correct.
So I guess my question is, Wendy, do you want discussion right now from the Freight Advisory Committee on this potential recommendation?
Yeah, I think we need it now, Brian and Holly, before we go on, because this is under that October 25th deadline. So this is also in part based on our discussion with all of you at our first meeting. So remember, this is meeting number 2. So we also took our notes from that first meeting and identified which corridors you all brought to our attention during that meeting. We took those to DOT and then came up with another recommendation and are bringing that back to you now.
So any questions or comments on that? We have a question from a Freight Advisory Committee member from Robert, and I'll just say it here, Robert. Is Southeast Alaska part of the primary highway freight system?
There is some discrepancy right now as to whether or not Southeast has any mileage on the network. From the federal freight tables that we were looking at, there is no mileage in Southeast Alaska on the PHFS. However, we did see in some of the shape files that we downloaded from FHWA, there is one segment there just outside of Juneau, South Franklin Street, is showing up on the federal shape files as a PHFS highway segment. We have talked to Federal Highway about this to get clarification. You know, why is this showing up as a shape file, but it's not showing up in the formal tables of record, you know, what segments are included on the network. So that's something that they are, I don't think FHWA was available, or they had a scheduling conflict for today's meeting, but it is something that they're following up on. And we're looking to get clarification from FHWA on this.
And then Robert, we're going to talk a little bit more about Southeast under the critical rural and urban corridors. So bear with us here just for a little bit while we get some feedback on the Dalton Highway.
Any other questions or comments on the potential recommendation to add the Elliott Highway?
Well, can I just ask, what's the downside? I mean, it seems like it may be pushing adoption of that, may push consideration of other critical pieces off the table. What's the downside of not including the entire Elliott Highway? Is there a strategic value in doing partial incremental links, or is it an all or nothing, and what's the downside?
Well, I think from where things stand today, as Wendy indicated, what we're asking for here is a bit more than what we're hearing from the feds. And again, we're not sure what they're going to come back with in terms of an allocation for the state. But in addition to this, into this recommendation, we were looking at two others earlier. You know, I mentioned the Seward Highway from Cooper Landing down to Seward. Thank you, Casey. You see those other options there. There's the Seward Highway and then the Richardson Highway down into Valdez. I think our thought was to have those as a contingency. If Elliott is shot down or the feds come back and say, no, we're not going to allocate, you know, all of that mileage, that there could be, you know, either Richardson or Seward as a contingency. Another option would be only to designate a portion of the Elliott Highway, and I think that is that's an option as well.
So one of the questions, and I want to be clear, Miles Brooks is also with FHWA and he's on the Freight Advisory Committee. And the reason he's not here today is he is attending a special webinar on this very topic, trying to hopefully get us some answers to this. It just happened to be double booked. So one of the questions he's looking at is, does the PHFS have to have logical termini? So if we just designate a segment and it kind of just ends in the middle of the Elliott Highway, is that okay? And so we're not 100% clear on that at this point. So we're trying to get some clarification there.
Yeah, and from what I can see nationally, there are other segments of the PHFS that don't have termini. So, you know, stay tuned for more on that. There are segments down in Texas, for example, that don't have any termini to another. It's not continuous, shall we say, with the PHFS. So stay tuned for more on that.
Go ahead, Joe.
Thank you. I think that designating a swath of the Elliott Highway, let me rephrase that. I think that we should be looking at this as a function of time and what we can get done. We know exactly what parts of our existing road system really need some attention. And if we highlight those as far as what we can get done in this 10-year plan, this 15-year plan, we can always work to redesignate things after 15 years, after we've really hunkered down and worked on the individual isolated areas that we need to, that we can get done, that we know that we need to get done. It seems like just designating a swath of the Elliott Highway seems like a waste of our road miles versus, you know, targeting specific things that we know that we need to fix and that we can fix within the next 15 years. Does that make sense what I'm suggesting?
That's an excellent point. And as a state, the state doesn't even need to wait 15 years. These priority freight corridors can be redesignated, every 5 years. And you raise an excellent point. I mean, if there are improvement needs on Elliott versus Richardson or others, does it make more sense to apply that priority designation on that roadway and maybe shift it, in the future? Again, it would give the DOT a greater number of options, a number of funding pots for programming improvements.
So to be clear, that section of the road is available it is part of the national highway system, so it is available for federal aid dollars. By designating it as a PHFS, it's eligible for additional dollars. And so
Correct.
that was the thought here.
When you've been discussing with DOT, this is Juneau headquarters, Central Region Planning, Northern Region Planning, South Coast Region Planning.
So again, the Dalton Highway came up during our last Freight Advisory Committee member, which has the different DOT folks on it. So we had been talking with Eric Taylor and headquarters on these, just to get an initial read, initial feedback, talk to FHWA, and then we're bringing these to you twice for discussion. So none of this is set in stone. This is all open for discussion.
We've got multiple DOT folks on this call. Is there anybody that, can weigh in that, has studied the road system more than us, or, all I hear is complaints from truckers. So, I mean, that's my non-scientific analysis.
So it'd be great to hear from Jackson as an MPO director. It'd be great to, Craig signed off, but we have John Cecil from AMATS. So that would be great to hear from them. Jackson, is he on?
Not sure.
Oh, I might have missed Jackson.
So this is Judy Chapman with the Northern Region, and I would just throw in there that to me it makes a lot of sense to include the Elliott. I know it's one of the it has a lot of rough services and differential settlement on it. Get a lot of complaints from truckers who are continuing on up to Dead Horse on the same highway. It's essentially part of the Dalton. So we could, obviously spend quite a bit of money on the Elliott. And I don't mean for that to take away from the necessary stretches in the other parts of the state, but it is a challenge to keep the Elliott in good shape. We've got quite a bit of sort of deferred projects that we need to address there that we're trying to get to, and hopefully we will in the next 10 years or so. But I would just support it. I also support other highways in the state, obviously, but this one tends to take a little more attention and focus just because of the ground and the climate change issues that we're dealing with.
Thanks, Judy. And I noticed Todd is on the call as well from Central Region. Todd, did you want to respond to Joe?
Well, I'll just say that not opposed to adding additional lane miles to the network. I think there was a missed opportunity in the last freight plan to add some of the urban miles in the acreage area on it, but it looks like they're included now. So I'm more focused on where the primary truck routes, numbers of trucks are heading to and from. Are we talking about freight to primarily support, day-to-day activities within the state, from the ports to the hubs, community hubs would be my focus.
Thanks, Todd. And I think we are designating quite a bit more for the urban freight corridors to kind of build out that network, which I think will address some of Joe's earlier comments as well.
Sorry to take the committee's time on this, but yeah, the Elliott Highway, I've been up and down it. It's true. It needs some work. Would you, at the current review level, what would be the second place and third place roads that would not be designated because we're designating all of the Elliott Highway? It seems as if, if we designated just the problem points on the Elliott, it could be 20 of those miles that we might be able to pick up a couple miles in some other second place or third place areas in the state.
Yeah, that's an interesting thought. And again, it comes back to Wendy's mention of federal highways need to get back to us on any guidance there with regard to the continuity of the network. And again, we were looking at the Seward Highway and the Richardson Highway down into Valdez as other potential options.
Once we get clarification, I know that it's a short window coming up on October 25th, but if it doesn't have to be continuous miles, it just seems beneficial just to highlight the 15 miles of serious problems in each area and just utilize that, and for the next 5 years work on that stuff, because we can get an extra little bucket of ducats and be able to work on the isolated problems versus the whole highway as a swath.
Mm-hmm. Well, that's an intriguing comment, and up to this point we have not done any analysis like at a sub-corridor level to really identify, breaking it up into sub-segments of that level of analysis.
Yeah, so we'll take that. I mean, Eric's on the call. We'll take that back to Eric. And Eric just raised his hand. Eric.
Yeah, I just wanted to mention that the other thing that came out in our conversation with federal highways was that, and this goes back to the options that they gave states to weigh in on. And he did say, you could reject both of those option 1 and option 2s. It's not like they're giving us only 2 choices. It is, we do have the option of saying, well, we don't want an allocation. We would prefer to, give you our highest recommended mileage for designation on the primary highway freight system. I think it is important to note that, this is a designation that has some posterity to it. So it does become part of a national system. So in that sense, you're not really looking at trying to designate problem spots or, for maintenance or for improvement, but you're really looking at, does this make sense to be part of the national freight network? So you are looking at a route as opposed to a section of highway. I think that's, that's something to keep in mind. And I from our sense of looking at it as a team, we're going, does it make more sense to look at mileage going north of Fairbanks, or looking at, say, something like connecting the Seward Highway down to the Port of Seward? It's just in terms of strategic importance.
So Brian, there was one question I just want you to confirm from Marie. She says the designation also does not change the amount of funding Alaska receives, correct?
That is correct.
Okay. It just makes this section available for different types of funding, right?
Right.
Okay.
Right. If you're at the DOT, it gives you a greater number of pots of funding at your disposal. As Wendy said earlier, I mean, like with the Elliott Highway, it's eligible for NHPP funding. But this designation would make it available for NHFP as well. So it just gives the DOT more options.
Eric, did you have your hand up again?
Yes, the one additional thing it does, the more PHFS mileage you have, your allowance of critical rural and critical urban mileage is affected by that totaling. It goes up because it's based on the total PHF miles in the state.
Yeah, that's a good point. And I think it's presently, like for the urban freight corridors, it would be 10% of the total, I believe.
Okay, so what else does the team need? What do you need any other direction at this point from the Freight Advisory Committee, or where do you want to go next?
Well, I think we were hoping for some consensus, and I do think I just saw Miles join, and he sent us an email while everyone was chatting that so far we don't have any word on if it's going to be, the deadline's going to be extended. So we do need to plan for that October 25th, which is 2 weeks away. And ideally, this freight committee would say thumbs up. Yeah, DOT, we support you on moving forward with this segment. We support you on asking for more lane mileage than it looks like might be allocated. So we are looking for some direction there.
Okay, Todd, go ahead.
Yeah, I was just going to ask, being the FHWA hasn't decided on what number of miles are going to allow, the two scenarios presented earlier. Is it one or none, or an example means they say you're getting 20 miles, you ask for 60, so you get none, or 20 of the 60, or is our decision based on, does our decision need to be based on what they're actually going to allocate to us?
So part of what they're asking is, do we agree, does the state or the Freight Advisory Committee agree with their allocation method? And if not, propose a different allocation method. So that is one of the asks. So we would look for a recommendation to propose a different allocation method. And we did have that discussion, Todd, and it's a little iffy. If we ask for too much, do we get nothing? Or if we ask for too little, do we get too little? So that's why we were hoping for an extension, because we imagine many of the other states are going through the same questioning process because it's not clearly defined. Eric, did you want to maybe help give some direction of what you need exactly right now?
Yeah, I think, we're really looking for a recommendation, and I think, to put this into context, they're asking all 50 states and the Freight Advisory Committees of all 50 states, to make their recommendation on the allocation method. So it's not like we are making a designation or anything like that. I think we're just trying to give you the information so that this Freight Advisory Committee can make the most informed recommendation. And then we'll put together a letter on that basis to submit into the federal system.
Go ahead, Joe.
Would you be able to zoom out on that map? And is there, I guess what I was looking for was that lower pink level. That's the road down to Valdez.
Yes.
Correct.
It's I make the comment frequently, the height restriction on the Dalton Highway is actually, the Eagle River Bridge. And, the weight restriction on the Dalton Highway is the Chalitna River Bridge that's just outside of Wasilla. Because if you can't get past that, you can't go the rest of 800 miles. I don't know the quality of the road that we're looking at right now versus the Elliott Highway. I understand that October 25th is coming up quick, but as far as, you know, looking for the committee's recommendation, I just would like to, you know, hear from DOT on, you know, that if we can't, you know, get freight off the boats and up into the system, it doesn't matter whether the Elliott Highway's good or not. So, I mean, we talk about intermodal transport, and, you know, that it just seems like I don't have enough knowledge, and I'm not the deciding factor on this issue, but it just seems like I understand there's a short time frame, but a little bit of analysis, or at least weighing in from DOT behind the scenes, and we can make these calls and meet again in, you know, 3 days if need be. But if this is a legacy thing, as much as I love the Elliott Highway, I feel like I'm going into this committee recommendation a little bit blind.
Go ahead,
So-
Wendy.
Yeah, so can you zoom out a little bit and let's talk about what's already in the PHFS, which is exactly, those areas are covered in the PHFS. So what you're talking about, a lot of those are critical urban freight corridors, critical urban freight corridors, and part of the PHFS. So we were looking for areas that don't have any federal designation to get that extra pot of freight money. So that's really kind of where this analysis came from. We went through the fast planning freight corridor plans, we went through the AMATS freight plans, and we went through the recommendations you made at the last meeting on what were critical freight corridors. And we looked at where there were areas that weren't taking advantage of that second pot of federal money. And so there weren't, frankly, that many roads that weren't taking care of it, or that we couldn't designate as a critical urban corridor. So we were trying to really find redundancy in the system, and that's largely how we looked at this, missing links and where could we build out that freight network and provide redundancy to the existing designations. Holly, it looks like we have a few more hands up.
Yep, we have Robert. Go ahead.
Thanks. I have to agree with Joe on principle about the lack of information and methodology. I understand what you just said there, but I still, you know, we've got 3 or 4 pink lines, if that's the color we're you know, possibly considering, and you know, there's no analysis offered as to why one should outrank the other, and of course I have the question as why there's no color connecting to Southeast. But for the other, I mean, Kenai seems like important. The points Joe raised are critical. Maybe they're covered, but why one above the others? There's I don't have any information to support a recommendation right now.
Okay. Any other comments from people who haven't had the opportunity to participate yet? Okay.
Yeah, so let's go ahead. I think the missing piece is, I do want to just say that, you know, we did talk about this at the last meeting. We did send out all this information in advance. We do have a initial freight corridor assessment that was released, and a transportation assessment that was released that describes these and volumes and things in more detail. I think it'll be helpful for this group to see what we're recommending for the critical urban freight corridors and the critical rural freight corridors. That's going to answer some of Robert's questions about the Southeast, and it'll start to paint the whole picture of the network. So Brian, why don't you start going through those and the additional designations and focus on how we looked at redundancy, how we really looked at those intermodal connectors, how to get freight from the ports out to the rest of the state. And that this is a statewide look of how to get trucks moving and connecting.
All right. From there, why don't we toggle back over to the PowerPoint?
What slide do you want, Brian? Do you know?
I'll tell you what, let's go to number 11.
How's that look? Is this the one you want?
That's it. And again, that's basically a listing of all of the highway segments that you saw earlier on the web map. Okay, so again, you can see where the interstates comprise the bulk of that PHFS mileage. But we wanted to give you a listing of what's on record, what has been designated to date as part of this priority freight network. All right, moving on. Yeah, there you go. I mentioned there are several subsystems under that. The middle box there is the National Highway Freight Network, which is an element of the National Multi-Modal Freight Network. The previous authorization, MAP 21, only looked at roadway-based facilities as part of a priority freight network. The FAST Act expanded on that and opened it up to multimodal facilities for ports and rail. But for our discussion here today, we're looking at the National Highway Freight Network. We've talked already about the PHFS, non-PHFS interstates. There are none of those in Alaska. But this next segment that we're looking at includes a discussion on critical rural and critical urban freight corridors. So this comprises a smaller portion of that priority freight network. Again, we're looking at those connections from major shippers and receivers and connecting them to the PHFS. And that's really one of the primary purposes of these designations. Okay. So this is what things look like today with regard to urban and rural freight corridors that have been designated by the state and certified by FHWA. And you see the urban freight corridors that have been certified are all within the Fairbanks urbanized area. The one critical rural freight corridor is a portion of the Dalton Highway. There's about 235 miles of the Dalton Highway has also been certified. And you saw that earlier on the web map, that turquoise, shown in turquoise on the web map. So this is the only mileage that the state has certified to date under these freight networks. Okay. So again, I mentioned earlier that our team was looking at additional opportunities for adding more mileage to those priority freight networks. There were several within the Anchorage urbanized area that have already been included in the PHFS as a PHFS intermodal connector. I mentioned roadways out to Ted Stevens, for example, and to the Port of Alaska. And in looking at the Anchorage urbanized area, Wazilla, there were other recommendations that we wanted to propose. This still puts us way under our mileage cap of 122 miles. So just some initial recommendations here from the project team to add to the CUFCs.
And to be transparent, Brian, these came from the freight plan, the AMATS freight plan, who has a freight advisory committee. So these were based off of what was in the AMATS freight plan. And these are, we also, this second tier that we looked at is, do they really connect the state and in a regional basis versus local circulation around, say, Anchorage? So we took what was already, the work that had already been done, and then we said, okay, is this regional, statewide connectivity, or is this just local? And so we went with the regional statewide connectivity. And then we also looked for redundancy, was a chance to provide redundancy for that regional and statewide.
It looks like we have a comment or a question from Todd. Why don't you go ahead?
Yes, I was looking at your list that you put up there earlier with the streets in the urban area, and I seen A and C and some of those other streets. And I'm looking at this list, and I seen the Seward Highway on the previous list, but what I don't see is Ingra Gamble. You know, Seward Highway stops at 40th. So I think, you know, you need to include Ingrid Gamble in that urban route.
We looked at that and let's double check on the map. We think it was because we had that very discussion. I think it's already a critical urban freight corridor or a PHFS, if we can zip back to the map.
Well, I think it did show up on the PHFS as, you know, on the map. It showed the line going all the way through, but I was just looking at the list that weren't, you know, streets that you were looking at identifying. So if it's on there,
Yes, we
great.
didn't want to double count. So if it
Right.
was already on the PHFS, it's eligible for essentially, you know, 2 pots of money. So then we're looking at elevating these other important connectors for those same 2 pots. So you don't want to double count your federal designations.
Right.
Very good.
So do we have the right area covered, Todd?
Yeah, if you can zoom out a little bit just to make sure that the, yeah, right there, Ingrid Gamble. Yep.
Okay, perfect. Thanks for, we did have that discussion, so thanks for double checking.
Okay, Steve Rebuffo has his hand up.
Yeah, thanks. Now, just a little bit of an apology because I came in late, so you may have gone over the theory behind this and I just missed it. But I'm looking at this graphic here now and I'm seeing that the AC couplet bridge down into the port was considered but not recommended. What was the rationale behind that?
I think that is already included as a PHFS intermodal connector.
So yeah, so Steve, I think the clarification here is considered but not recommended. It was in the AMAT's freight plan as a critical corridor, but it was already designated as a PHFS. So we did not call it an urban corridor as well.
Okay,
So again, it was another case of double counting.
Yep, fair enough. Thank you for that.
Yeah, but we'll clarify in our considered but not recommended where we had it. We'll note that it was already included as part of another national freight system.
Perfect. Thank you.
Okay, Bruce has his hand up. Go ahead, Bruce.
Yeah, I just, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, good. One of the things I was thinking about is I've been doing some other freight plans for some of the other states in my previous job, is a lot of the state freight plans, when they were doing their principal corridors, did not recognize military movements. And that's one of the things that I was recognized as going through this plan is there's some very distinct military cargo movements in the state. And you should probably be given some bump or leverage to make sure that those military cargoes and those military movements are recognized as being important to those freight systems.
Thank you. And that was one reason we considered the Valdez connection earlier, was specifically related to the military movements from the port.
Yeah, that's why I was trying to say it without saying it. So thanks.
Okay, let's go to Steve again.
Yeah, no, I was going to make a point of clarification on that. But if the method or the theory behind the ask was with respect to munitions movements out of Valdez, then that makes perfect sense. For movements of the brigades into and out of Anchorage, very little, if any, of it is done on the roads. So that's almost taking care of itself. And if they are, then it's handled by commercial companies, and it looks just like any other freight movement that we would do through here. But everything that comes into the port either comes in the back door or it comes on the rail. So there's very little need to get in and gum up the normal traffic flows with military equipment, which is really not the same in a lot of other places in the country.
Thanks, Steve.
Okay, so Brian Lindmood has a couple of other similar comments in the chat, and I just want to make sure that some of his recommendations here, like I'm looking at the web app, He brings up the Muldoon Tudor curve. That's already included in the PHFS, correct?
Correct.
Forgive me, I don't remember what all the colors are, but the one
Yeah.
thing that has no color at all is Reeves between 3rd and 5th. And everything that comes up Reeves right now takes a hard left on 5th. And that's not connected at all. You seem to imply that it's going through Mountain View, and frankly, probably not even 10% of it goes that way.
So Brian, you're saying that missing segment to Fifth Avenue
Yep.
should be included?
Yes.
Hmm.
And the other part I was going to add, and if you zoom out, I can see if it's still there because it seems to blink on and off. C Street between Ocean Dock and Whitney. All your high wides out of the port go through there. All your traffic that goes from the port directly to our trains to Fairbanks goes through there. So C Street north up the tie-in to that giant spaghetti bowl there by the gate needs to be in it.
Any comments to those additions? Any objections? Support?
Makes good sense. Saves.
Okay. Yeah, those seem to make good sense to me too, Brian. Thank you.
But other than that, I lost track of what all the different colors mean. So,
Well, if you see a color, it means it's eligible for 2 pots of federal funds.
well, I gave you the list of pretty much where all I know gets out of, the Ship Creek area and the port.
Perfect.
Whether it's either, headed south down AC Street or headed north on the highway. What happens after it gets through downtown, I don't know. Other than I do know the main highway route around the Anchorage core is Tudor to Muldoon.
Yeah,
There's a fair amount of truck traffic on that.
Yeah, and we've got that.
So other than that, I don't know anything.
And then in one of the additions was adding the International Airport Road all the way out to the new Seward Highway. And we recognize it's just a right turn on the frontage road to the Seward Highway, but that's an important redundant corridor from our perspective, getting in and out of the airport. So adding a little bit of redundancy there.
Okay. So where are we going next? Team.
You want to look at Wazilla?
Oh, Palmer Wasilla, yeah. I went on mute. And again, this was redundancy in the system. If something happens at the big turnoff, the flyover, then where can we have some redundancy in the system? So that was largely the impetus for adding this as a critical urban freight corridor.
Any comments about Wasilla? Palmer. Do you agree?
Thumbs up.
Palmer Wasilla Highway, going once. Okay. No comments.
All right, let's go southeast.
Okay, before we move away, well, it's fine where you are right now, Casey, I think, but somebody asked about Trunk Road. Would Trunk Road qualify, or does it play a role in the urban or rural critical
All right,
freight network?
Casey, can you go back up to Wasilla?
Okay.
this is Connor. I was just, I just thought
And
it.
zoom out
for
just a
this-
little bit more.
Trunk.
It's just a little bit to the east there,
Yeah.
like right there at the inner, like the 3, where you see the 3. I believe that's it right there.
I keep
There
trying
you
to
go.
point for and it doesn't help. Yeah, right at that interchange, Casey.
It's just to the
And then
north.
head north. Well, yeah.
I guess it's the north segment of that. Yeah. Because if we're talking in terms of redundancy, I figured if we're gonna designate the Fishhook Highway or the Palmer Fishhook Road, that the trunk might serve as also a an alternate route there if something were to happen along the main corridor there in Wasilla.
Any other thoughts on that? Concerns about adding that, support?
I think there's a major medical facility there as well, so having some redundancy is probably a good public safety issue.
Okay.
Yeah,
All
and
right.
I know there's some more businesses going in, I believe, too, at the Fishhook Trunk interchange. That's an area that's kind of under consistent development, it seems, over the past couple of years.
All right, we'll take a look at that one too.
Can we talk about limits? Would that extend below the Parks Highway?
I think below the Parks Highway, it becomes more of a local connection. I think the idea here is the redundancy. You can, if something happens on that segment of the Parks Highway, there's no good way around it, and you could shoot up north and then circle around it. But down south, I think it's just really local.
Okay.
Okay, are we ready to go to the southeast now? I think
Southeast.
so. Okay, thanks, Casey.
Do we want to start in Juneau or Ketchikan?
Let's start in Juneau. So Brian, I can't remember the Industrial Boulevard. Was that an urban corridor? Like, or was this the?
We've covered all of the urban corridor recommendations.
So for Southeast, one of the things we're waiting for Miles on is our understanding of the definition of urbanized is by census. And if you go by the census area, Juneau does not meet the urbanized definition. If we go under the federal highways definition, Juneau might. So we don't know if we can designate urban freight corridors in Juneau yet. And for rural freight corridors, we only have about 10 miles left.
That was 9 or 10.
9 or 10 miles left. So Southeast is a little bit pending for these designations as part of the freight plan until we get clarification on the definition of urbanized for these particular corridors.
So I don't mean to call you out, Miles, but Miles did join us if you do want to weigh in at this point. If not, that's also okay. Yeah, looks like
nothing to add at this moment.
Okay, thanks, Miles.
So right now, Southeast and Ketchikan are largely left out.
Well, the whole region's left out.
Yeah, fair.
And the thing is, this one region, we talk about regional and statewide connectivity. Southeast Alaska is not serviced by Anchorage or the rail belt. There, you cannot get, freight moved. I try to get a car from Anchorage. Well, you ship it to Seattle and then you ship it up. So, I think even though we recognize Southeast is only about 10% of the state's population and economy as a distinct region, I think it needs to have consideration for strategic movement of freight and how that's done and have it recognized.
So I think we're somewhat hamstringed by federal rules for what we're talking about now, but we also are going to recommend state corridors that are important, and that's where Southeast is going to come in. And so that will help if we just look at the state multimodal freight network. So we want to make sure that we designate those key corridors in Southeast as well. Whether they can be eligible for this federal funding, that is what we're still working on, and we'll come back to you with more on that.
Okay, I appreciate that, but I think also, the urban communities are really important for the region, but you've got a critical port like up in Haines and Skagway that do have federal, importance. So those need to be recognized for the movement of state and international freight through those two ports.
Yes, and we do recognize those as part of the state's multimodal freight network that we'll be getting into here momentarily.
Yeah, but I'm here to argue for Southeast and as well. So
well, that's fine.
Just to point out, history can be instructive to us, to some degree. When we needed to ship aviation fuel to Fairbanks in World War II, the place to do it was from Haines north, and that's why the big tank farm was there. That's why the pipeline was there. So there is federal significance there. So I don't want to lose that perspective. I appreciate that it's significant in the state's plan, but I think there's a federal designation that needs to be looked at as well.
And that's where, like I said, Robert, we're trying to get clarification on those rules. We recognize that Southeast is underrepresented in these federally designated freight corridors. So as we get clarification, we'll keep this group posted and updated on that. Absolutely.
Thank you. Appreciate that. I hope I can make up for some of that underrepresentation without being obnoxious.
It's why you're on the committee, Robert.
That's right. We need all different points of view.
Yep, exactly. That's what makes this a better plan. Let's go ahead and take a look at the statewide multimodal freight network.
Okay, I'm going to share my screen again for this part. Oh, unless you just want to stay on the map. Do you want to stay on the map or do you want to go to the presentation?
Good question. I think why don't we go to slide 18, Holly?
Okay.
It has a definitive list. I think while you're doing that, I'll just update the group on again the difference between the distinction between the federal designation that we've been talking about so far today. We're going to move over into the state's priority freight corridors, really freight facilities. So it's not only highway segments, but it's also airports, water ports, other facilities that are critical to the movement of freight throughout Alaska. And if you recall from the previous meeting, there are numerous freight facilities that appear on this state priority freight network that you didn't see on the PHFS. So we're looking at things like, the Trans-Alaska Pipeline System, the Alaska Railroad. There's other modes. There you go. There's other modes. We recall this graphic from the previous freight plan. So again, we're trying to draw a distinction between our discussion on the PHFS and this discussion, which is on the state's priority freight network. So it's multimodal. It includes not only roadway, but also other modes of freight transportation. So again, as part of the freight plan's development, we're reopening this, looking at this again, working with you as a freight advisory committee to have a conversation on additional elements that should be included as part of that priority freight network. And I guess maybe from here, Holly, we just go to slide 18. There we go. The gentleman earlier mentioned the Port of Haines, and we have that as one of the recommendations to add. It's currently not on the state system, but our team was looking at the proposal to add Port of Haines to the state's priority freight system.
And Robert, that was the map from the 2016 freight plan. So our current freight corridors will indeed have the Port of Haines on there.
Thanks. Can I also just mention on that point, the Port of Haines is actually 4 miles from town, so that mileage may need to be double checked.
Thanks.
Okay, did you, go ahead.
What was the ask there again? Not
Just
sure I
we need to
understood.
double check the mileage on Haines.
Okay, I mean, we were showing that from the port up to the border.
The border is between 40 and 42 miles from town, depending on where the mile marker recognition is. The Port of Haines is 3.5 miles. It's adjacent to the ferry system's terminal there, just northeast of town, about 3.5 miles.
Yeah, our recommendation was to add not only the port, but also the roadway that serves it.
So that's okay. We'll clarify that and make sure we get the whole thing covered, but.
Okay. The next one you'll see there in Skagway, the Klondike Highway, again, from the port up to the Canadian border.
I think you can keep going, Brian.
All right, we had 2 other additions. Front Street and A Street, the Port of Manana.
And the reason for both of those is to get from the Parks Highway to the port, you have to go down A Street to Front Street. So it's just connectivity from the parks down to that port, recognizing it as a riverine port.
All right, so those were other proposed additions. The Whittier Highway, the Whittier Tunnel, very strategic facility that helps facilitate the movement of freight. We're also recommending that as an addition to the state's priority network or system. In Wasilla, we just talked about this a few moments ago, the Palmer-Wasilla Highway. We're proposing that as a recommended addition. And then wrapping up the list are several ports. We talked about Haines already, Manana, and Port Clarence, which is a port of refuge. We've had some back and forth on that, whether or not that would be a logical addition to the state's priority freight system or not.
I'll leave that up to you guys if it's logical, but I think, this is Lee speaking, I think it's an important port to be recognized. Discussions are, national security with the Coast Guard's holdings there, the airport itself, and then the potential for road connectivity between Port Clarence and the highway by near Teller or Cape Woolly. So I think if it is recommended, or not recommended, if it is designated a priority freight network, that would allow government and private entities to work toward it becoming a supporting port for the Port of Nome, the Bering Straits region, and the only natural deep water port north of the Bering Strait, or north of the Yukon. So I appreciate that.
Okay, and the Port of Nome, by the way, is already on the system.
Yep.
In
And then a question on that is, I saw Port of Kivalina. Are you talking about the Red Dogs port site, or are you talking about actually Kivalina on the previous map?
No, so that's the Red Dog site. Again, this is the map from the 2016 plan, and we feel like it's important to show you what was in the last freight plan. But in our current mapping, Port of Kivalina has been appropriately named the DeLong Mountain. I can never remember it, but the Red Dog port.
Okay, cool. Thank you.
Yeah, so that'll all be corrected in our current mapping.
Awesome.
Any other comments or reactions to this draft list?
All right, so, okay, we have like 13 minutes left, Wendy. How do you want to use this time?
So I want to kick it back to the committee just a little bit. We still have the freight actions. We were hoping to get to talk about those a little bit more, but again, I think we've spent most of our time on the priority network. It's been a good discussion. I think it's been a healthy discussion. So I think I would propose that we take the freight actions and we kick those out to a future meeting, if that works for this group. And I guess the next question is, we can get all of this mapped on a hard copy, send that out for final comments and review, if that would be helpful. So help us understand what will make you feel more comfortable about these recommendations and how they fit into the overall freight plan. So a little bit of feedback from what you need from us.
Go ahead, Joe.
The map helped tremendously as far as looking at the proposed roads, both urban and rural, and the statewide. The map helped immensely as far as me really being able to look at Anchorage and looking at Fairbanks. And that's it. I mean, it just helped.
So would it be helpful for everyone to have hard copies of all of these maps once we kind of have the proposed final?
Absolutely.
All right, so for the next, we'll get those sent out. We'll do it in the form of a meeting summary. So as part of our meeting summary, we'll include hard maps of all of this. And then our next meeting, we'll start talking about freight actions and really dig into those. And then regarding the PHFS, I think we need to go back to Eric and strategize a bit more on that and figure out how to proceed and what they need for a recommendation and what they want to submit on October 25th.
Are you comfortable just polling us electronically once you have some little more feedback? Because I'm not opposed to any of the scenarios. Just nice to know, a little bit more about the all or nothing question, and then what some of the considerations were for the other links like Kenai. Because if you could get strategic value out of a number of small segments, then we might want to spread it around. But I certainly support the direction it's going in.
So Eric, would you be comfortable if we kind of regroup as a team? We come up with another strategy forward, and then kind of informally poll the Freight Advisory Committee through email or some kind of polling survey monkey and get some feedback that way?
Yeah, I think it'd probably be, I mean, if we could, schedule a brief meeting or whatever, so we could, give people an opportunity to talk, would probably be good.
So Eric, you're recommending that we have another Freight Advisory Committee before October 25th?
I think if people are up for that, otherwise, we could also, like you said, do a polling by email.
So I'm going to have to kick it back to the Freight Advisory Committee. Can we squeeze in another meeting? We're not going to have a lot of new information. That's what I'm a little bit concerned about, is when are we going to have these answers? And I mean, we're essentially 2 weeks and 2 days away from actually we're 9 working days away from having to have an answer, Eric. And we're still waiting on some clarification from Federal Highways. And then you, Eric, have to pull together that final recommendation. So that would put another Freight Advisory Committee meeting next week.
Yeah, if that's too soon for everybody, I mean, we could put together something, send it out by email and just have everybody, respond in, in the affirmative or if they have any concerns.
Okay, so I'm going to ask for a thumbs up here. If you would prefer email, could you give us a thumbs up, please?
I was looking for the other button, but I'll just add a quick thumb in the mirror here.
Hands up, thumbs up, clap, something.
The alternative being another meeting?
Answers are kind of important.
Yeah, so the alternative is another meeting, which we would have to try to find a time where we can all meet next week.
You guys are the pros on that. So I think that, I mean, if you can come up with the most efficient way that to present that information that is going to be useful to you guys. But I do feel like those answers are fairly important for us, whether it's a quick meeting like this, or if you're able to communicate it within a document somehow, that might suffice too. But the federal questions are fairly important.
Yeah, and my concern there is when are we going to get those answers? And I hate to schedule a meeting and we don't have the answers, although I guess I can cancel it at that point, right?
Mm-hmm. We could just like get something on the calendar for next Wednesday afternoon or something. We could just do it.
Let's just do it right now. Let's get it on everybody's calendar.
Okay. It'll be I'm gonna schedule 90 minutes. We may not need that much time, but I'm gonna get 90 minutes on your calendars for Wednesday afternoon, the 20th.
What time are you thinking, Holly?
I don't know, 1 or 1:30.
Brian, does that work for you?
I'm open, yes.
Is it possible to do later in the afternoon?
2, 3.
3.
My plane lands at 2:30, so anytime after that, I'd be on.
Yeah, I'm bombed until 3.
So 3 o'clock Alaska time?
Thanks.
Okay, we'll do it.
Brian, does that work for you?
Sure does. I'm wide open.
Are you wide open? Is it dinner?
Wide open.
Okay, thanks for that.
All right, and Holly, I think the goal for this one is this will be the 3rd meeting on this topic. So let's keep it to an hour and try to be respectful of everyone's time.
Okay.
All right, so Holly will get that invite out. We'll do our best to get answers. If we don't have answers, I think we have to cancel the meeting, but we will keep you posted. It's a placeholder for now. We will keep you in the loop on how things are progressing. We'll get these meeting minutes out to you and some hard copy maps.
All right.
Excuse me, this is Aves. Will there be maps before our meeting?
Yes.
Thank you.
They may not be super pretty, but they'll communicate the information effectively because we can just kind of print what we have. All right, with that, I think we can close the meeting and we'll see you next week.
Thanks.
Thanks, Wendy.
Sounds good. Bye.
Thanks for your participation.
Thank you.
If the team wants to hang on for just a second, it might be worthwhile. Brian, Holly, Eric,